we're going to really try our best to give you as much of an overview of what FCC or Family Center Coaching is. We also want to emphasize why Family Center Coaching is important, especially today and what's happening across the country in our communities. And then we also want to talk a little bit more about how it actually works. And so we have two individuals who will be joining us that will specifically get into some of the mechanics. And we certainly hope as we get into that conversation that you'll join us through the Q&A. So you should have, there's a feature on your screen that should give you the ability to go ahead and post your questions there. And if you do have any issues, go ahead and you can enter them into the chat if you're having some technological issues that you think might be on our end. Again, I'm Diana Dollar, and I'm the Executive Director at the Prosperity Agenda. And before we get into the details of Family Center Coaching, I just wanted to explain a little bit about TPA. We are a nonprofit organization that works directly with nonprofit and government and business to design, test, and scale career readiness and financial capability solutions, specifically for families who are experiencing persistent poverty. And it's our work that directly aligns, and it's our approach. We take a very person-centered approach to how we work, which is exactly what our work does to align with Family Center Coaching and what we are doing in partnership with Kellogg Foundation. Kellogg has actually created the Family Center Coaching model, and it was because of the work that specifically Paula Sammons, who's a program officer at Kellogg, her vision was really to create a model, Family Center Coaching model, which took a very whole family approach to building relationships when it comes to interacting with individuals, or I should say families, in your community. And so our opportunity, we were selected by Kellogg Foundation, is to bring this model to communities across the country. And we're extremely pleased because of the fact this work aligns so closely to our desire to really bring the voice of the individuals, the voice of the families into the work that we all do. This work was developed over about an 18-month period, and they went through an extensive testing period and putting it into communities directly. We actually have one of the community organizations represented with Melissa, who will be joining us in the conversation. And we were fortunate enough in bringing that model into our work and being able to scale it across the country to really get a sense of how the practitioners themselves have had the ability to work with the content of the model. So one thing that Kellogg wanted to really emphasize in this model is that it is available to anyone, meaning that it's open source. And so as we go into this conversation, I want to encourage all of you to go to the website, the address that you see on the bottom of the screen. Go ahead and download the toolkit. There's information in there that maybe Melissa or Devin, you might call out specifically. And if you're listening, and if you have some questions, or if there's thoughts of what that actually looks like, you can certainly get that straight from the website. So I believe that this is a good time, Devin, for us to transition to you, and I want to introduce you first. So Devin Stubblefield, who is a lead consulting trainer with the Prosperity Agenda, he's been working and delivering financial coaching, career and life coaching, and now Family Center Coaching to organizations, government, and nonprofits across the country, and working also directly as a coach with individuals and families for almost 10 years now. And we're very fortunate to have you, Devin, working with us and delivering this across the country. So I'm going to let you take it from here. Okay.
Thank you, Diana. I really appreciate that. And good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're at. It's just a pleasure to be here today to share some things with you that I think you'll find valuable as you consider family-centered coaching. And so when we talk about really what is family-centered coaching, it's this whole notion of keeping the family in the driver's seat. In other words, we want to make sure that everything that we do is completely based on what is important, what's relevant for them, and that the focus is not just on the individual that might show up in the office for the appointment, but the focus could be on the family dynamic, and those people that are in their home or other people in their lives that they really do feel or consider them to be family. And so we want to take into account that, and with that comes different perspectives. And so what we're going to talk about today is how you can actually take this approach and make it work within your organizations. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the mindset. As you all know, when you go through coaching training, there's lots of discussion around mindsets and how a coach is actually presenting him or herself to any client or parent that might come into the office for services. Now, here's the thing. There is a distinction between case management, traditional case management, and coaching. And what we want to do is we want to focus on the strengths. We focus on the capabilities and the things that really help that family to focus on themselves. A lot of times in a case management setting, we have certain things that we want to accomplish based on agency guidelines or program guidelines. And so it's a different approach. But this coaching approach says, again, that family is going to be in the driver's seat, and everything that we're doing is going to be based on what's important and relevant for them. And so when we talk about this mindset of family-driven, again, we are putting them completely at the center. Now, that means, though, that you or the coach has to think about how you're going to do that. And so when the toolkit was being developed and information was coming forth from all the consultants around the country and organizations that had a part in how this content was being developed, what emerged was the fact that there has to be a way that a person can actually adjust themselves to what's actually coming forth from the parent. Now, traditionally, again, in case management, we may have a single focus, and that could be to get a family or a person to the particular outcome or the goal. And then in traditional coaching, it's similar, where we're actually helping them to get the steps done to get to the goal. But what we didn't account for is the different things that might be going on in their lives or their motivation or readiness to change. And so family-centered coaching has what is known as the fluidity of approach. Now, I want you to really take a look at what you see here on the screen and notice what is before you. Now, there is a circle, a graphic here, and in the perimeter of the circle is racial equity. And what that means is that we want to make sure that every person, every family feels that they are inclusive, that they're important, they're valid, and that our services are really geared towards helping them where they are at. Now, if we do that, that means, again, as I mentioned earlier, we have to maybe adjust how we are being with that person on that day. And so there are three different disciplines that informs how a person would maybe respond to a family or a parent that's in your office. And so the fluidity of approach says that we may move into a case management mode where we're helping them to resolve a particular urgent issue, and we're helping them get to a particular point. That's case management. Then it could be that we might be having some conversation around their readiness to change. And so we want to go into readiness assessment, understanding exactly what's triggering them to feel like they want to pursue a goal, or maybe they don't. Maybe they feel like this is not the time. Maybe they do recognize that change is possible for them, but maybe they just aren't ready to take the first step. So that's what the readiness assessment piece is. But then what happens is when a person is clearly ready to take action, to go to the next step, to move themselves forward, then that's when we go into this goal setting or the coaching mode. And so the fluidity of approach says that depending upon what's showing up on any particular day of meeting, then we adjust our approach to one of these three. Okay, and the toolkit goes into lots of detail about what each of these means. But the bottom line is it really creates a scenario where the family really feels like it's really about them, because we are adjusting to them. We're not asking them to adjust to us or adjust to our agency. We're saying, let's meet you where you are, and our engagement is going to be based on what's appropriate, based on where they are today. And so I want to just kind of say again out race and equity. It's really about, we all have what is known as implicit biases. And one of the things that is important in family-centered coaching is that we recognize, our own implicit biases, but then there are also institutional things that might be going on that could make a family feel like they're excluded. And so what we want to do in this context of family-centered coaching is to explore, really how individual and systemic biases impact the families. And really, what does that mean to them? Because it could be that it's creating a very stressful environment for them. There could be levels of trauma that they experience, chronic trauma. And it could happen on a daily basis based on systems and things and programs and guidelines that might make a person feel like it's really not geared for them. And so what we want to do is just really raise awareness that we need to be mindful of these things. And so if a family is feeling like they are really not inclusive of the process, then we can adjust so that we can certainly help them to feel like they are. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are some other things that might be going on, such as trauma. Okay, so the toolkit does go into specifics about how can you respond when a family or a person is definitely experiencing the effects of trauma. Now, again, as we talked about, racial equity, it could be that this feeling of exclusionary things might create this trauma feeling. And so what we want to do is think about how we can actually create an environment that can actually accommodate that person so that they can get at ease, they can feel more comfortable, and that we can move on in a very meaningful conversation. So the 5 things that you see on the screen here are things that you can actually implement when you're working with someone just to help them feel like it's really, really about them. So you see safety there, choice, empowerment, collaboration, and trustworthiness. And the great thing about it is the toolkit, again, goes into much detail about each of these areas so that you can learn really how to respond when someone is experiencing trauma. But there is another area where there could be some chance of, there might be some hindrances there from the parent if they have diminished executive skills. Now, executive skills are these cognitive abilities that helps us to do certain things. And the main thing is that how we organize and plan things. So we organize, we have time management, and we can plan and prioritize. But if there is a particular diminishment of one or more executive skills, then these things can't happen. In other words, people lose the ability to organize, they lose the ability to plan, and they lose the ability to prioritize simply because cognitively there's something going on. And so we want to think about how we can help that. Then there's another area of executive function that happens is how people are able to react to things. And then you see there's response, inhibition, flexibility, emotional control, stress tolerance, and metacognition. These are areas where people in their minds are able to react and respond in a meaningful way. But again, if these are diminished, and maybe these are not really working for them. And then finally, the third piece of this is how people get things done. Okay, this is actually where it comes in. And you might notice that some people within your organizations that have been in your caseload for quite some time, and maybe they're not progressing as fast as maybe you would think that they could. Well, it could be that their executive skills might be a little diminished. And so look at these things here that says task initiation. Maybe a person has a little bit of trouble getting things started as far as actually implementing or a task. Or sustained attention. Maybe their attention span's a little short and they can't really sustain it for a long period of time. The one I like to really pay attention to is goal-directed persistence, meaning that if something happens along the way that could make a person feel like that the goal is now hard, even though they may have started out pretty strong, got a few of the tasks done, but now at some point there's something else going on where they feel like, well, maybe the goal isn't for me anymore. Well, we need to really think about how we can address their goal-directed persistence and really get to the bottom. And then finally, working memory. Some people just simply can't remember things as well as others. And so the combination of these things is this whole function of executive skills. And so what we are suggesting here is that you take a little bit of time to go through these areas, check them out. Again, there's lots of information in the toolkit, and it's really designed to help you to figure out how you're going to respond to people if these things are showing up. But then there is a third element, and that is behavioral economics. And I know that behavioral economics has been prevalent in financial coaching and career life coaching, but now here in family-centered coaching, really it's all about doing things that's really going to reduce the cognitive burden on families. And in other words, we want to help make decision-making a lot easier. And so that's what behavioral economics is. People have biases, they have context, and those things are playing out every single day. And so when you're having a person think about pursuing a goal or getting better or moving their family forward, there could be some hassle factors that are popping up, and there could be some other things that that they're maybe having trouble with because they don't really know how to get around them. So we want to make sure that as you are thinking about this, to understand that behavioral economics is real. There's this whole notion of scarcity and what happens when a person is experiencing chronic scarcity where things are short, everything is short, there's no slack. And so behavior changes. And so we want to make sure that you are totally in the know that in the toolkit, we have lots of suggestions and resources that can help you to adjust when these things are happening. So those three disciplines in terms of what might be showing up on any given day, the trauma, executive skill diminished, or some form of behavioral economics playing out, these three things really is going to dictate then how the approach should be given by the coach. And so when we talk about the bigger picture of family-centered coaching, there are 6 particular steps. These steps are really a framework. So if you had to think about how you are going to execute on a family-centered coaching in your organizations, you can look at it from this perspective. It's simple as 1 through 6. And even though it may seem like a lot, it's really, really very congruent, and they all work together. Step 1 basically means preparing for the meeting. We want to make sure that coaches are totally ready for the engagement that's going to happen. 2, moving into building that relationship, making sure that there's rapport and that people really do feel that the process is relevant and appropriate for them. And then we got to really fine tune it. And so this is where we're going to focus our work. You may be familiar with the Wheel of Life. That tool tends to show up in lots of different coaching applications, and it certainly shows up here. What's interesting about the family-centered coaching approach there, the wheel is made up of 7 different domains, and each of these domains may relate to different areas of their lives. Now, here's the great thing. The toolkit has content modules based on all 7 of those domains. So you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to, really have real in-depth knowledge, but the content modules will give you enough information where you can have a working conversation, and there are resources and additional information that you can tap into to get further knowledge on that particular topic. And so I think that's really one of the powerful points of the toolkit, because it allows you to really go a little bit deeper on some of these life domains if the family or the parent really feels like this is an area of focus for them. Now, then when we get into step 4, it's about the stages of change. And that's really about assessing their readiness, okay, their readiness to move forward, their readiness to do something different, or their readiness to even be engaged in a relationship with your organization through coaching. And so there are things that you're going to learn in the toolkit, and this goes to the fluidity of approach I was talking about earlier. And so really assessing that stage and then responding appropriately. Then, of course, the step 5 is getting into plan, do, and review. And that's more about setting a priority goal and then putting in place the steps to actually get there. And then finally, step 6 is about support and accountability. And how can you create a framework that's going to work best for that particular parent and be supportive of them throughout the entire process. And not just supportive of them, but supportive of their entire family dynamic as they bring that information into the forefront. And so those are the 6 steps. Okay, those are the 6 steps to family-centered coaching. And again, the toolkit has very, very explicit details on each one of these steps and how you could make them work. Now, of course, there's some benefit to this. And of course, we've been talking about families all together. Yes, they're going to benefit, but we want to say that you benefit too. Coaches benefit from this actual engagement because it really, again, going back to coaching in and of itself, coaching is all about helping the person be empowered to take action on their own, to get to their finish line. And so the coach, it takes a lot of stress, a lot of responsibility off the coach, and it places it back on the family. So you're facilitating this process. And so again, there are some benefits to you as well. And so I know I just shared a lot with you, and what we thought would be good is if we actually brought in one of our partners who actually have done this and who've been very successful with it. And so I'd like to invite Melissa Hall-Sommer. She's the Senior Director of the Family Economic Success at the Brighton Center, and she's agreed to come on here, and we're going to have a great conversation with her in regards to how they have actually done family-centered coaching. So, Melissa, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, we are so glad that you're here today. And before we get into, our interview here, would you mind just sharing a bit about yourself and your organization?
Sure. So my name is Melissa Hall-Sommer. I work with Brighton Center, and Brighton Center is situated on the southern bank of the Ohio River. We serve the 8 northern counties of Kentucky, so it's northern Kentucky. And Brighton Center has been in existence since 1966. We began our journey as a storefront operation, dealing with families that were moving from Appalachia to a more urban area and helping with that transition. And here we are, 52 years later, still in existence. And one of the things that really drove our work is the fact that we ask our customers, our region, our stakeholders, what are the needs of the community? And we have grown from there. Last year, our organization, which at the core of our mission is to help people reach self-sufficiency and self-reliance. And so we served about a little over 40,000 individuals through 39 programs. And so we have a broad scope. My role is I'm the Senior Director of Family Economic Success. And what does all that mean? That means that I work with our Family Center. I work with our early childhood education. I work with our workforce development team, our financial coaching group and financial wellness group. And I work with our workforce development team to really come together using a philosophy of financial opportunity centers and work with families to reach their hopes and dreams. And so we at the core have had family-centered work throughout our history because we started with families who are moving into our area and not really knowing what the next steps were.
Wow, Melissa, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it sounds like you guys have been doing some great things over the years. And thank you for being here today to share with us. And so I want to just go ahead and get started and just ask you a few questions that we really want to kind of hear more about how your organization has adapted the family-centered coaching. And being that you guys have had such a long history of family-centered work in general, how has the emergence of the Family Center Coaching Toolkit enhanced what you were already doing in your work with families?
Mm-hmm. So we had the opportunity as a grantee of the Kellogg Foundation to be a part of the development of the toolkit. And the reason that was such an exciting project to us is that we had been doing family-centered work for years. We had worked in the family development realm, and all of our, as a matter of fact, to the extent that all of our core values were based on family-centered priorities. Back in that day when those came out, we really aligned our core values with family-centered practice and some of those principles. So when this opportunity came forth to look at how is family-centered coaching doing, without doing, and we had been doing coaching through financial coaching for a while and had trainers on staff, et cetera. But what was desirable for us about this is the opportunity to inform the work, to raise practice, and then, this is the exciting part, evolve practice. And so the fluidity of this toolkit, I've been around a while. I was just commenting on my little gray streak here that I'm seeing but I've been around a while. And so as part of being around a while, I know that there are things that have come out in the past and we've done it for a while. And then the practice gets a little stale. And I'm seeing that there's 69 people out there that are all shaking their heads, I'm sure. And we never have a fluid way to inform our practice. And what an amazing opportunity to have this toolkit out there, open source. So we're pulling in information from folks and we're improving and sharpening the practice every day. So it's just a beautiful opportunity, and it was a win-win for all of us. It really raises the tide. So that's kind of what we looked at when we were thinking about the emergence of the toolkit. And for us, we were looking at the 2-gen practice and the whole family practice. It really was an opportunity to say, how do these two things intersect, and how does our practice intersect?
Absolutely. That is amazing. And, I really love what you said about the fluidity. And it's interesting that whole concept of fluidity is in the toolkit, but you as an organization actually took that on in terms of your evolution of your family-centered work. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And so now I want to really get into, this process, this process of, your staff transitioning into using the Family-Centered Coaching Toolkit. And, let's talk about, what worked well, but also, if you don't mind, let's share what kind of tripped people up.
Mm-hmm. And that's what we like to talk a lot about. So I'm so glad you put it in those terms. We talk a lot about what's tripping us up, what trips up our families. We have the families talking about what's tripping them up along the way. But I think that when we started this, it's really interesting. We have 185 staff on board. We are still kind of deepening across the board where the practice is happening. So we started within our STEPS project, which was Kellogg, and we were part of the testing of the toolkit. And so as we've I look at it as an onion, kind of moved out into across our organization, the broad organization. I think that one of the hardest things for folks is that we kind of hold on to our practice. So if you are a case manager and you're the best case manager there is, you are really into being a case manager. And if you're a coach and you're a purist coach, you're holding on to that coaching principles. And I think that it's hard sometimes because this truly is when you show the wheel of kind of the fluidity approach, it's a little difficult because those folks that like to sit in that case manager seat, it's hard to say, you need to get up, move over to your coach seat. And so it's keeping each other kind of accountable in that respect. And the coaches who tend to be a little like, well, I don't think that's really empowering people by doing it that way. So we all get into our own, what I call kind of camps, our own practice camps. And so it's how do we come together and say, all of the practice informs and lifts up, and all of the practice can help families as they sit in that driver's seat, because our case managers have always taken the approach of the family is the driver, the family is the leader. One of our core values is people are experts in their own lives and they know them best. And it's at the core of our organization. So that's always been there, but I think that it trips people up sometimes because they're kind of into their expertise and owning their training and really having a hard time a little bit of how do we go in and out of these roles and when to do that, and how does it best serve the families who are leading their own journey.
Yes. Oh, wow. You really hit on some very important points. And I love how you distinguished how, case managers want to case manage and coaches just want to coach. And so traditionally, you're right. Those disciplines really in and of themselves, they're pretty focused on what they do. But this brings them together, that fluidity. And that's what I think is the uniqueness of this toolkit and the application. So thank you for sharing that. And so you got figured that out and you started going with it. But what type of feedback did you get from your coaches and feedback from the families based on the specific tools and the steps that you guys kind of outlined for them using the toolkit?
So I think from the perspective of the families is which, the feedback, we want to make sure as being having a truly two-gen practice that we're getting family voice, and that's important. And so as we're continuing to move this out, because it's certainly being used a little more deeply in some areas of our work than others, as we move forward, I think some of the biggest things we hear from families is, well, aren't you going to tell me what to do? So the ones that are used in case management, it's the same thing. Like this is how we do things. Like you sit down and you kind of give me recommendations, and then I'm the driver, but I get the recommendations. We're trying to really build that executive function and how that works. And so that's the little like pushback, like, well, what trying to, and I think the key to that, and I'll talk about this later, is you have to take the families on the journey too. You have to make sure that if you're changing your practice, you don't just show up one day and start acting different. It's like any kind of relationship. You have to make sure, and it's all about relationship. We know that. It's all about the relationship you build with the customers you serve and the families you serve. But it really is about showing when you show up and you're transitioning that you take the families on the journey of this transition too. We're adjusting some things in our work. This is what it's going to look like. We want to hear how it feels to you, because that becomes part of the continuous quality improvement. And in addition to being fluid in the practice and having this toolkit, we have to understand we have to be fluid and improving and getting better. And we talk a lot about failing fast and improving. And so if something's not working, we have to, number one, have a deliberate way to get customer voice. Number two, listen and course correct from customer voice, and take them along the journey to say, we're going to be going about things a little bit differently. This is what this might look like. We want to know how this feels as folks supporting you in your journey. And I think from practitioners' perspective, again, mindset, practice mindset. We have folks that have been steeped in trauma-informed care, which is one of the dimensions of the toolkit, and some that have the MI kind of. And so it's like, well, how does this fit with the practice of MI, meaning motivational interviewing? So how do some of these practices that we've adopted and we've embraced, kind of, how are you weaving practice into the fluid of this? And so that has to be intentional as well, because there's lots of value to those practices that we've had woven into our work. And what does that look like? And what does that feel like as you're having this the fluidity of the work?
Wow, that is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I think we got a new sound bite, take the family along the journey. That was awesome. Thank you so much for giving that to us. But you're absolutely correct. I love what you said. You just don't change stuff and then show up and be different with the people you serve. You kind of bring them along and help them understand what these changes mean. We at the Prosperity Agenda, we talk about coaching socialization, where we help people to really understand what the relationship is going to be about. And that's exactly what I believe you described there with what you guys did, in terms of really making sure that you're leaning in with those families and making sure that they are resonating with what's actually happening, how you're delivering your services. I think that's so important, because that could lend itself to retention. In terms of people sticking with the program and then getting to the finish, because if they feel like all of this is really geared towards them and they really feel that the agency or the organization really does care and they really do want to understand how it's working for them, I think that creates a very, very awesome win-win scenario. So thank you so much for giving us that information. And I know you touched on it a bit, but I think that the audience would really benefit from hearing a little bit more about some best practices, because it seems like you guys have really done a great job in terms of really figuring out, how to adjust here as you're doing this. But what would you recommend to organizations and coaches as they consider adding family-centered coaching to their service delivery models?
I think the first thing is to be organizationally prepared, that you're getting buy-in from your customers first as part of the first step of that journey. Is this, we don't want to sit in the room and make decisions in isolation and be working upon people. It has to be among. And then they have leaders that understand. So how many of us go to trainings? And when I was at the work, I try not to be this person as an organizational leader, but go to a training. We think it's awesome. We come back, we put it on a shelf, and there it sits, because it's really there's not a place for it in our organization. And so how are we preparing the foundation of our organization to take this shift and to adopt the practices and to really understand what that means? And we're journeying on this. I always think that the reason the fluidity is so important and keeping this fresh is that we're not arrived. We haven't arrived yet. We're still working. We're still getting there. And we look every day and see this is clicking, but boy, we need to look at that over there. So I think that being organizationally prepared as much as possibly, but not so much that you're paralyzing yourself. Like, we got to have the exact right time, because sometimes you need to begin stuff and be ready to make it better and inform everybody. I think understanding 2gen and whole family practice and what that means. So you have family-centered practice, which we're understanding, but what are the implications of the whole 2gen movement and whole family movement? How does that intersect? Because we're talking about family-centered practice, but we're also talking about whole family practice. So what do those intersections look like? And taking a bit to examine what your service portfolio looks like and how people's mindsets are about whole family, and how we're helping the family to understand that they're not being served in silos. They're being served as a whole organism, a whole moving, beautiful piece of this community. I think finally, and you talked about it as part of it, that cannot be the add-on, that cannot be the piece and part or the set aside, but you have to embrace, understand, and integrate or bake in a racial equity lens. And that's a journey. That's a journey too. But sometimes you have to realize how far away you are from where you need to be in that work, both as an organization, as an individual, as a community. And because it can't be, I heard a wonderful trainer say that, it can't be like you get a nice little pumpkin bread and you have nuts on the top and you can pick those off, or it can't be the raisins in there. It has to be the cinnamon. It's got to be baked in, because we cannot move families forward in this country without addressing racial equity.
So, Melissa, can I ask you to expand a little bit on that? Because we have a question that somebody is asking, how equity and the social groups that families are embedded in, how that shows up in their needs. But I'm wondering, just if you could go deeper in terms of how you're doing that. What does it look like? And it might not be clean, it might be a little messy, but can you give a little bit of the how that you're doing that?
And for us, it was looking at the journey and really, we always had an inclusion committee. We always had a diversity committee. We did all those things. And I sat one day in a session that was hosted by Kellogg and talking about equity, and quickly realized that we were doing some things really well, but we weren't doing equity the way we needed to. Mm-hmm. We weren't looking at equity from a perspective of what it really was. It's not, we want, inclusion is about getting everyone at the table. Equity is about seriously addressing disparity and implicitly talking about the implications of racial equity. So what we started that as a part of our journey and our work by first foundationally changing our core values and adding a specific core value around racial equity and equity as a whole. And then we looked at our strategic plan and said, is this really a priority if it's not our strategic plan? And then, digging deeper, talking about how do we address disparity? How do we even know where disparity exists if our data can't tell us that? if we can't look at our services and our results and see where there's disparity, then we're not prepared to address equity. So we started looking at how do we collect our data? How are we looking at where all that? So we are on a journey of kind of changing how we look at data across gender, across race, and then finally explicitly having conversations about race and understanding that it can't be the thing that we don't speak of. It can't be the implication that we don't speak of. It has to be integrated. It has to be something. And it was always here, but we are making sure that we're talking specifically. If we're looking at a situation where we have folks who maybe Hispanic women who are not retaining jobs at the level of other women, we have to talk about the implications of the equity implications and disparities that might exist. If we're talking about men, African American men who are not getting jobs at the same rate after going through our programs, if that exists, then we have to be prepared to understand that and talk specifically about that. And schools have to be prepared to do that. Government organizations have to be prepared to do that, and people are not.
How is Family Center Coaching helping you dig deep and get into those conversations?
I think it's hand in hand. I think you have to be prepared to foundationally look at your organization to be able to me, it's chicken and the egg. So, we have the fluidity of approach, that whole thing. And that if you look at the slide, it's all surrounded by the racial equity piece. And we can't just say, oh, look, there it is. We have to say, oh, look, how are we foundationally ready to drive family-centered coaching by having this truly baked in like cinnamon into what we do? And that's a journey for us and for folks. And we have to be able to say where we're not to be able to even address where we need to be as a society, as organizations, as individuals. And so from a coaching perspective, I want to make sure I attempt to answer the question. Everything in the coaching toolkit looks at how families are addressing, but how they're journeying and what their journey is like. But the ability to talk to folks from the perspective of and making them feel comfortable to say, one specific situation, I feel like I need to advocate for my son in school. I'm getting called from work every day, and I feel like they don't understand my son's journey as a young African-American man, young man in schools. And what does that look like? And what does that feel like? And so understanding that people's journey are driven by their own reality and their own, and what they're facing. And I think that the ability to keep attention and foundational commitment to that has to happen before you do coaching, before you even adopt the toolkit.
That's really great. I wonder too, and there's another question that I don't want to get off this topic because it's certainly something that we feel is really important in the coaching model, the Family Center Coaching model, is dealing with bringing that whole perspective. We also understand that there are pressures related to program requirements. So there's two different questions that I think we might be able to try to answer at the same time. One of them has to do with funder requirements, and that it can be inconsistent with the way that coaching is intended to be, how that relationship is established. In other words, how the goals are set, which is really driven by the family. So there's one question, which is just basically how do you communicate with funders, how to let families drive those goals that may not necessarily be something that you'll know at the front end. And then if you can also take a little spin on that and respond to, there's a question about like TANF. You got some pretty specific requirements that the program needs to adhere to, or the participants' families need to adhere to. How does Family Center Coaching live in that kind of constrained environment?
Well, I think that when families certainly understand the requirements that are set for them with TANF, I think that us thinking that they don't is doesn't give credit to where families, they understand and they're working hard to get where they need to be. But sometimes that's the frame. It's like when I talked about taking along the journey, some of it is, as part of this program, this is the focus of this program. So we have 39 programs, some of which have very stringent. And so understanding being a part of this program is kind of part of that pre-program coaching, like before they get a part of the coaching. So you have chosen this. So we're, as part of your experience, you're choosing this program. In choosing this program, there are requirements as part of this program. And so it's understanding how their goals and mapping out things sometimes is before they choose their program. For us, that's a little bit easier. I apologize about the noise. For us, it's a little bit easier because we have a broad array of programs. So sometimes people come into our Family Center, which is many times the entree into our services. And so they can get some of those coaching elements at that point that helps them get a direction. Now, some of that's case management too, like depending on where people are, if they're in crisis and they're trying to get out of crisis, you're jumping into case management mode to get them stable so they can move into coaching mode. But some of that's that conversation and helping them to understand the program that they're moving towards or the program that they're venturing into. I think that some of the experiences that we have is that we are one of the operators for the American Job Center in our region. And so we have WIOA requirements, but we have found that as we're journeying into deepening our coaching in that area, that's been something that can trip things up. So it's an opportunity to look at, and again, feedback from the families, get into that CQI moment. No one likes to use the word fail, but fail fast and fix, what is working, what's not working. Did you feel empowered through the process? Did you feel like you were making decisions? And that gives us and enhances the progress. And so I think that sometimes we sit back and think, should we start this coaching thing? Will it fix? But sometimes it's like beginning and understanding and laying a groundwork and testing. For us, we tested with our STEPS group, really deepening the family-centered coaching. And then we're able to and moving out. And again, I will say this about our coaching. I will say this about our whole racial equity lens. We are a work in progress. We will always be a work in progress because we will always be striving to be better.
That's great. Devin, I don't know, you probably had some other questions as well. I just felt like, as you're getting into the issue of racial equity and really understanding that this relationship between, toggling between case management, coaching, and even motivational interviewing, because I know that a lot of training has happened out there across the country. And much of why Kellogg developed this model to begin with is because of acknowledging that it isn't a one model or one size fits all. So, what if somebody wasn't trained in any one of those elements? Did you find that the implementation of family-centered coaching, because it incorporates a lot of those disciplines, did that have any effect in terms of was there other training that needed to happen, or what was the implementation like for the staff if they weren't trained in something like motivational interviewing or trauma-informed care? Even though I know that your staff was I think you said most, if not all, were trained, right, in terms of trauma.
A lot of our folks are trained, not all, but a lot. And so those are the things. What we did was we took it as a really broad resource to everyone. And then we had the work happening deeper in places. And then we have taken the stance of looking at our service bundling opportunities and taking deep dives around certain things. Like one of the things we talked about practice, we used a self-sufficiency matrix as kind of an assessment gauge that families lead by kind of looking through that and using the self-sufficiency matrix as a process. So that's not part of the toolkit, but we use it as part of our practice across the board. And so taking that tool and saying, shoulder to shoulder, what is this looking like for you as a family? Where do you see your priorities when it comes to this? So there were areas that folks needed more training. I feel like there were experts. We have experts in our organization, subject matter experts that kind of lift up and can provide that training. So our organization is very large. So we have opportunities where folks might be very steeped in MI over here, very steeped in trauma-informed care, but we're wanting to look at everybody having a minimum kind of exposure to things and opportunity to go deep. And again, we're stepping through this as we go as a large organization.
Right. That's great. I also want to go back to something that you talked a little bit about, and that is a lot of families that come in when they're experiencing a personal crisis. How does the Family Center coaching work in terms of being an effective intervention? So in other words, definitely people are entering in those moments where coaching is not necessarily the approach. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing staff effectively, or maybe not? I think that may be one of the sticking points in terms of being able to toggle between case management and coaching.
So our family center is where folks walk in, and sometimes they're walking in on the worst day of their lives. You know, they slept in their car last night. They were thrown out of their house. They were assaulted. There's a whole litany of things that they're in emergency crisis situations. And so at that time, many of our staff are taking a case, kind of a stabilization approach. Like, how are we helping folks to feel safe? How are we helping folks to feel like they are heard? And how are we helping them get connected so that they can be stable to begin to move into what we call stabilization, which is kind of the next step of transitioning into more of a coaching approach. So the way we handle that is we know the techniques around coaching, but we meet the customer where they're at. And we don't leave them feeling like, you know, if you come from a purist coach perspective, when someone's in a total crisis, they'll be like, you know, what are you doing? I mean, so it's really trying to understand and be able to meet the customers where they are and make sure that they are able to stabilize their situation so that they can address and move into that that pure driver's seat. You know, it's like they're sitting in the driver's seat, but they don't have any keys, they're out of gas, and they can't even start their journey. And so, like, how do you get those things assessed so that they can like turn the key and start driving their boat again, and their bus. So,
Devin, did you want to add to that?
I think what Melissa shared was on point. It was completely on point, and I really appreciate that. But what I did want to do, Dana, for our audience, I wanted to go back and summarize her best practices. And so, right. Melissa, let me know if I got them all. But the first thing you said, to be organizationally prepared for the shift into this type of engagement. And then you said that for them to understand two-generational work and the integration of family-centered and the whole family dynamic. And then you came back and said how to embrace and understand and integrating the racial equity lens so that it's baked in and sprinkled on. And so I thought that was brilliant. And then you said, fail fast and fix. And so those were the four best practices that I just wanted to reiterate for those that are listening from around the country, from this organization that clearly has got a great handle on the execution and the implementation of family-centered coaching. And so, again, Melissa, thank you so much for giving us such great information today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm glad you summarized those points, Devin. Mm-hmm. So thank you for doing that. I want to go back to one question. We have just a few more minutes, but I do want to go back to one question that talked about funders. And back to what I was asking, and basically, we can all answer this question, which is somebody who really wanted to get some guidance on how to utilize the family-centered coaching approach while still meeting expectations of funders. So often there's an expectation that there's some specific goals that the families are going to engage in. And I just wonder if we can maybe summarize some advice in terms of how to really approach conversations with funders when there is this expectation at the front end that we're going to set the goals for families and not let them set the goals. And we have definitely seen this in some of our work as well. So I don't know, Melissa, if you have the ability to dive a little deeper into that, or maybe provide some guidance or thoughts, and Devin as well.
Well, I think Devin has probably seen it in his vast and deep work that he has done. But I think that sometimes funders, it's actually bringing things to the table, like the commitment of large national organizations like the Kellogg Foundation, because the research is done. If you look at the research that's been, and some of the papers produced by the Kellogg Foundation and the work that's been done by, Aspen Ascend, its ability to take them, again, it's taking folks along the journey, like taking funders along the journey. So when you're starting this, kind of saying how this is going to enhance the work that they're paying for already, I think and some folks say, great, because what we did was we did this, but then we did a 2-gen logic model or theory of change that addressed individuals, family outcomes, and then child outcomes. So it had the whole array. And we were saying, like, this gives what leverage that gives their funding, number one, because it's not easy always organizationally or administratively. If you have any CFOs on our CFO would say this turn is not always easy, but it's bringing the funders that you have along, helping them to understand that you've gotten customer voice, that there's research behind this, that there's outcomes behind this. It's really driving the results. But I think that it's also about, like, when we look at funders like WIOA, that we had to make a commitment to look at bringing some private funds to the table to show and be able to offer some services and weaving private and public dollars together, which is a win-win, because it leverages private dollars and it leverages public dollars. And then you get results. And then what we're hoping then from there is we can say, look what happens when you bring this practice to a very governmental kind of approach, and you bring this family-centered practice into it and weave it in. And the results and the findings from that can then be taken to the policy level.
That's great.
That's kind of the continuity. So bring your funders. We had, we are very lucky. We have funders that are very open to the whole family and family-centered approach. They understand it. They've walked beside us in our walk. We have other funders who are more state and government funding who we're going to have to bring along. And sometimes that has been, in some cases, bringing small private funders to the table, looking at the implementing practices within those big investments and saying, this is the result. And then we haven't gotten there yet, but then our hope is then to bring that to the policy and the state level to say, this is the implications of that. When the state representatives are writing those statewide plans for TANF, when they're writing those statewide plans for workforce, that this can influence that piece of it.
That's great. Thanks, Melissa. That actually, you captured a lot of what, and I would say more specifically in terms of what are tools or approaches that other organizations could use when they're just entering into the application or use of family-centered coaching. We've only got a couple more minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that I talked about what's next. So, Devin, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to summarize before I do that.
Well, what I wanted to say is this: we want to make sure that when we're top funders, and the biggest thing that I hear around the country is, this whole notion of these outcomes. And I know that sometimes these family goals and these outcomes may take a little bit longer than maybe what our program might be required to complete them by. And so there's this dynamic between, the pace of the customer or the pace of the client versus the pace of the programmatic outcomes that we're looking for. So I think over time, the more that organizations are sharing information with funders and through their reporting processes, that, helping them to be more aware that if we are truly saying this is a family-led process, then of course we have to consider the speed of that process. And so knowing that they're not always aligned, but I think at some point, once, the data continues to come in, and as Melissa said, that the results are certainly there, that, we get this a little bit more flexibility around the fact that some of these outcomes are going to take a little bit longer because of different things that might be going on with these families. So great. I just wanted to add, yes.
Thank you, Devin. And thank both of you for Melissa. Thank you so much for joining us. always like to take a practical perspective, which is really, again, the voice of the practitioner in this. We also appreciate knowing that you're representing the voice of the families as well in that experience. So thank you both for spending the time talking a bit more about the details of what Family Center Coaching is. I want to encourage all of you to take some time to actually download, if you haven't already, the toolkit at our website, FamilyCenteredCoaching.org. You'll find that in addition to the toolkit, that there is an organizational assessment tool that you can use to determine whether or not are you ready for Family Center Coaching. And I know we didn't talk about that, but we do have we have a little, you have an option on our website to schedule a call, and we can talk a bit more about not just the assessment, but the whole toolkit if you'd like. And we can also explore if you're interested in taking the next step in terms of engaging in the training. So that's definitely something that's available to all of you right now. The recording of today's conversation will be available. It's on Facebook, and it'll be on our website blog by the end of today. Somebody did ask about the slides, and we'll make sure that those are available as well. So I think I covered it. We're going to have another webinar coming up in another month. And so stay tuned for that. And again, I want to thank you, Melissa and Devin, for joining us. And then everybody else who's out there who joined us today, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.